Charlotte, North Carolina, a city alive with energy, ambition, and the promise of a fresh start for so many. Families build their lives here, carving out routines, forming bonds, and living stories that seem on the surface ordinary. But now and then, a story emerges that shatters this illusion of normalcy. This is one of those stories. Kayla and Mariah Johnson, identical twins. To the world, they were the kind of sisters you'd envy. They laughed together, celebrated together, and were always seen as a package deal. Wherever Kayla went, Mariah wasn't far behind. They were described as inseparable, unbreakable, but what no one could see was the growing tension beneath their smiles, a tension that had been quietly building for years. But Wire was pushing back on the yearning together, and understood that if they went together hunting, things got naughty. For those who knew them, the Johnson twins were a portrait of loyalty and love. Kayla, the shining star, full of charm and ambition, always seemed to light up any room she entered. Mariah, her quieter half, was the steady presence, often in the background, supporting her sister in ways only a twin could. But what happens when admiration turns to resentment? When a bond forged by birth becomes strained by unspoken feelings and a sense of competition? And what happens when someone they both love unknowingly fuels the fire? On a humid July night, the fragile balance between the sisters finally gave way. At 11:23 p.m., emergency services received a frantic call. A young woman had been found in her apartment, unresponsive. The voice on the other end of the line sounded panicked, but as details emerged, the story that would unfold was far from what anyone expected. Kayla Johnson was dead. Her life was cut short at just 26 years old. The scene inside her apartment told a story of chaos. A wine glass shattered on the floor, a faint trail of blood near the doorway, and signs of a violent struggle. But what stood out most to detectives wasn't the state of the room, it was the relationships surrounding Kayla's life that would uncover the truth. The investigation quickly revealed that this wasn't an act of random violence. This wasn't the work of a stranger or a break-in gone wrong. No, the real story lay in a rivalry that had been years in the making. It wasn't jealousy over money, success, or possessions. It was something far more personal. Kayla and Mariah shared everything. The same DNA, the same childhood, and unbeknownst to Kayla, the same love interest. Derek Thompson. A man who, without meaning to, became the match that ignited the flames of jealousy and resentment that had been smoldering for years. As detectives began to piece together the timeline, it became clear that this was no accident. Kayla's death was the result of a confrontation that escalated in ways no one could have predicted. And at the heart of it all was the one person Kayla trusted more than anyone in the world. This is the story of a family torn apart by jealousy, of a rivalry that blurred the line between love and hate, and of a bond so strong it was almost impossible to imagine it ending in betrayal. But it did, and it left an entire community questioning how such a tragedy could have unfolded. Stay with us as we take you into the lives of the Johnson twins, into their secrets, their struggles, and the deadly confrontation that would forever alter their family. This is Sisterly Betrayal, Twins' Jealousy Sparks Deadly Confrontation. Kayla Johnson. The name alone brought a smile to those who knew her. At 28 years old, Kayla was a nurse, a healer in every sense of the word. Her laughter was infectious, her energy magnetic. Patients adored her, colleagues respected her, and friends marveled at her ability to brighten even the darkest days. Kayla had a way of walking into a room and making everyone feel like they mattered. To her, life was something to be embraced fully, and she did just that. But for all her brightness, there was another shadow in Kayla's life, her twin sister, Mariah Johnson. Mariah was the quieter of the two, the one who preferred to stand in the wings while Kayla basked in the spotlight. She worked as a teacher's aide, spending her days patiently guiding young minds. To her students, Mariah was a gentle soul, someone they could trust. But to those closest to her, Mariah was known as someone who often kept her feelings locked away, hidden behind a wall of politeness and composure. The bond between Kayla and Mariah was undeniable, but their differences were equally striking. While Kayla thrived on attention, Mariah seemed content to fade into the background, until fading became unbearable. It wasn't just their personalities that set them apart. It was the unspoken tension that lingered between them, the silent competition that only they could feel. Growing up, it was always Kayla who got the compliments, Kayla who won the awards. Kayla seemed to effortlessly glide through life while Mariah worked tirelessly to keep up. And though Mariah loved her sister, there was always a part of her that wondered, when would it be her turn to shine? When would someone finally notice her, see her, and choose her over Kayla? That someone would come. His name was Derek Thompson. Derek Thompson was everything you'd expect from someone who worked as a fitness trainer. Charming, confident, the kind of man who could hold your attention with just a smile. He met Kayla first, striking up a conversation during one of her evening jogs. Soon, Kayla found herself falling for him. They, also, soon found herself falling for him, but Derek wasn't just seeing Kayla. Unbeknownst to her, Derek had also caught Mariah's eye, and while Kayla saw him as another exciting chapter in her life, for Mariah, Derek was something much more. A chance to finally feel special, to be seen, to have something her sister didn't. For months, Derek dated both sisters without either of them knowing. He played the role of a gentleman perfectly, telling Kayla all the right things while charming Mariah in secret. Perhaps Derek didn't mean to hurt anyone. Perhaps he thought he could keep his secret forever, but in a world as tightly knit as theirs, secrets have a way of unraveling. The truth began to emerge in subtle ways. A text message was left unread on Mariah's phone. A casual mention of Derek's name at a family dinner. Little moments that didn't seem important at the time, but, in hindsight, were the beginning of the end. And as Kayla and Mariah began to piece together the truth, their relationship began to shift. For Kayla, the betrayal was unthinkable. Derek had lied to her, yes, but the idea that her sister would entertain the man she was dating, that cut deeper than any lie he could tell. And for Mariah, the realization was equally painful. This wasn't just about Derek. This was about everything she had ever felt. Every moment of being overlooked, of being second, of being less than her sister. Friends noticed the tension before the sisters ever admitted it. Kayla became quieter, her usual radiance dimmed by anger and confusion. Mariah, on the other hand, began withdrawing even more, retreating into herself, avoiding conversations, and dodging questions about what was wrong. To outsiders, it looked like the twins were simply growing apart. But for those who truly knew them, the cracks in their relationship were impossible to ignore. And Derek? He seemed blissfully unaware of the storm he had created. Or perhaps he chose not to see it. He continued his double life, oblivious to the damage it was causing, until one day, the fragile balance between the sisters finally broke. Kayla and Mariah had always been two halves of a whole, but as jealousy, resentment, and betrayal simmered beneath the surface, the bond they had spent their entire lives building was quietly disintegrating. And when the final confrontation came, it would leave one sister dead and the other facing the weight of an unspeakable crime. This wasn't just a love triangle. It was a collision of years of unspoken pain, unresolved feelings, and a rivalry that had been waiting to erupt. The Johnson sisters had always been known as a pair, but in the end, their story would be remembered for the one moment that tore them apart forever. Charlotte, North Carolina. A city that buzzes with life and ambition. Known as a hub of culture and opportunity, it's a place where dreams are built and futures are carved out. The city's skyline sparkles at night, a beacon of hope for those who call it home. But for the Johnson sisters, hope had turned into something far more complex. They lived in Maplewood, a quiet suburban neighborhood nestled just 15 minutes from the heart of Charlotte. On the surface, Maplewood was the picture of tranquility. Streets lined with neatly trimmed hedges, rows of colonial-style homes, and children playing in cul-de-sacs after school. It was the kind of place where neighbors waved to each other from their driveways, where block parties were regular events, and where no one ever locked their doors. The Johnsons' home was no exception. A charming two-story house with a white picket fence and a porch swing that seemed to invite the world in. It was the kind of house you'd see on the cover of a real estate brochure, a symbol of stability and comfort. But as we know, appearances can be deceiving. But it wasn't just the house that held the weight of their conflict, it was the entire neighborhood. Maplewood's manicured lawns and friendly neighbors painted a picture of perfection, but the truth is, every street has its secrets. and the Johnsons' secret was on the verge of unraveling. It was a crisp winter evening in December when Derek Thompson decided to celebrate his birthday. His small apartment was filled with the sound of laughter, music, and the clinking of glasses. Friends from the gym, a few co-workers, and even some neighbors had gathered to toast Derek's 30th year. Among the crowd were Kayla and Mariah Johnson. Neither sister had any idea the other had been invited. Kayla arrived first, as radiant as ever, carrying a bottle of wine and flashing her signature smile. She moved through the room effortlessly, greeting strangers as if they were old friends. It wasn't long before Derek noticed her and welcomed her with a warm hug. Everything seemed perfect, until the door opened again. Mariah stepped inside, her expression reserved as her eyes scanned the room. The moment she spotted Kayla standing by Derek's side, the air in the room seemed to shift. To everyone else, it was just two sisters at a party, but to Kayla and Mariah, it was a confrontation neither had prepared for. Throughout the evening, the tension between them was impossible to ignore. While Kayla laughed and chatted with Derek, Mariah hovered at the edges of the room, her eyes fixed on the two of them. At one point, Derek, ever the social butterfly, pulled Mariah into a conversation, oblivious to the way her gaze flickered toward Kayla. For the sisters, every glance, every word exchanged between Derek and the other felt like a dagger. Witnesses later recalled how the atmosphere seemed strained whenever the sisters were in the same space. Subtle digs disguised as jokes, strained smiles, and moments of quiet hostility painted a picture of a rivalry that had reached its breaking point. But it wasn't until later in the evening that things truly began to unravel. Around 10 p.m., the sisters slipped out into the backyard. At first, no one noticed. The party inside continued as usual, music blaring, conversations flowing, and Derek basking in the attention of his guests. But outside in the cold winter air, a different kind of scene was unfolding. Neighbors who happened to glance into the backyard described seeing Kayla and Mariah standing under the glow of a single porch light. Their voices were hushed, but their body language spoke volumes. Kayla, arms crossed, her expression one of defiance. Mariah, hands clenched at her sides, her face a mixture of anger and pain. Though no one could hear their words, the argument was obvious. What they were arguing about that night would later become the focus of investigators. Derek, their fractured relationship, years of resentment. But whatever was said under that porch light marked a turning point, one that neither sister would come back from. The party eventually ended, and the sisters left separately. Kayla was seen saying goodbye to Derek with a hug, her laughter echoing down the hallway as she exited. Mariah left quietly, barely acknowledging anyone on her way out. To Derek, it was just another successful birthday celebration, but to Kayla and Mariah, the night had set off a chain of events that would lead to tragedy. 2 weeks later, on a gray January morning, emergency responders were called to Kayla's apartment. A concerned coworker had reported that Kayla hadn't shown up for her shift and wasn't answering her phone, something completely out of character for her. When first responders entered her apartment, they found Kayla lying on the floor of her living room, unresponsive. At first glance, it looked like a tragic accident. There were no immediate signs of foul play, and it was easy to assume she had suffered a medical emergency. Kayla's colleagues and friends were devastated. The outgoing, vibrant nurse who had touched so many lives was gone, just like that. But as investigators began their routine examination of the scene, details began to emerge that raised more questions than answers. Kayla's apartment was impeccably clean. Too clean, some might say. There were no signs of a struggle, yet something felt off. A mug sat on the coffee table, its contents untouched. Her phone was on the kitchen counter, with several missed calls and texts from friends and coworkers. And then, there was the peculiar detail of the front door. Unlocked, even though Kayla was known to be cautious about security. The medical examiner's report would later reveal the true cause of death. Kayla had been poisoned. A substance commonly found in certain over-the-counter medications had been administered in a lethal dose, carefully concealed in what investigators suspected to be a drink. Suddenly, this wasn't a tragic accident, it was a homicide. News of Kayla's death spread quickly through Maplewood. Friends, neighbors, and co-workers were in shock. Who would want to harm someone like Kayla? The cheerful nurse who had dedicated her life to helping others? The questions were endless, and answers were scarce. Meanwhile, Mariah's reaction to the news raised eyebrows. Friends described her as distraught, yet strangely composed. She attended Kayla's memorial service, standing quietly in the back, her eyes red but dry. When asked about her sister's death, she offered few words, only saying, "I can't believe she's gone." But behind closed doors, Mariah's behavior began to draw suspicion. It wasn't long before investigators turned their attention to those closest to Kayla. And when they discovered the tangled web of Kayla, Mariah, and Derek, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Kayla Johnson's death was a devastating blow to everyone who knew her. Friends and family described her as a beacon of light, kind, selfless, and full of life. How could someone like Kayla, who brought so much joy to others, meet such a tragic and unnatural end? It didn't make sense. She had no known enemies, no apparent conflicts. On the surface it seemed unexplainable. But to the detectives assigned to the case, something about the scene didn't add up. At Kayla's funeral, the grief was palpable. Her colleagues from the hospital, neighbors from Maplewood, and close friends gathered to mourn her sudden loss. Among them was Mariah. She sat toward the back of the church, dressed in black, her eyes rimmed with red. To those who didn't know her, she appeared devastated, a sister broken by the loss of her twin. But for those who knew the Johnson family well, something about Mariah's demeanor felt unusual. Detectives at the funeral were there to observe. It's standard procedure in cases like this. Watch how people react, listen to what's said, and look for anything that might offer a lead. As the mourners hugged and exchanged stories about Kayla's life, Mariah kept mostly to herself, her expression shifting between grief and something harder to define. When questioned later, one of Kayla's co-workers mentioned something peculiar. Mariah, during a brief conversation, had said, "I guess I'll never really have to compete with her anymore." It was an odd thing to say, out of place at such a somber gathering. Was it simply a slip of the tongue? Or did it point to something deeper, something the detectives couldn't ignore? The investigation into Kayla's death began with a thorough examination of her apartment. The initial findings were perplexing. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken locks, no shattered windows. Whoever had been there the night Kayla died was someone she knew or trusted. But it was the forensic evidence that started to reveal the truth. On Kayla's coffee table sat a single mug, its contents tested and confirmed to contain traces of a lethal substance, a substance often found in over-the-counter medications but toxic in the dose discovered. The poison had been carefully administered, dissolved and masked in a hot drink. It was a calculated act, one that spoke to premeditation. Detectives turned to Kayla's phone for answers. Her text message history offered a window into her personal life, her friendships, her romantic interests, and most revealing of all, her complicated relationship with Mariah. In one exchange just weeks before her death, Mariah had sent Kayla a series of angry messages. In one, she wrote, "You've always taken everything from me. Why can't you just leave something for me for once?" The bitterness was unmistakable. But what really caught investigators' attention was the night of Derek's birthday party. A string of texts sent from Kayla to a close friend detailed the argument she'd had with Mariah in the backyard. Kayla described her sister's behavior as intense and borderline frightening. She mentioned that Mariah had accused her of being a backstabber and claimed that Kayla always tried to ruin her happiness. For detectives, these messages painted a picture of escalating tension, a rivalry that had grown dangerous. Then came the biggest break in the case: witness statements from Kayla's neighbors. A couple who lived in the apartment next door reported hearing loud voices coming from Kayla's apartment on the night of her death. The argument, they said, lasted about 20 minutes and ended abruptly. The voices were muffled, but they were certain it was Kayla and another woman. The wife told detectives, "It sounded heated, like they were fighting about something personal, but then it just stopped." That same night, surveillance footage from the apartment complex's security cameras showed Mariah entering Kayla's building shortly before midnight. She was carrying what appeared to be a small bag. The footage also showed her leaving just over an hour later. Detectives now had a timeline and a suspect. When Mariah was brought in for questioning, her story was inconsistent. She admitted to visiting Kayla that night, but claimed they had only spoken briefly and that Kayla was alive when she left. When pressed about the nature of their conversation, Mariah became defensive, insisting it was just family stuff. But her vague answers only raised more red flags. The detectives weren't convinced. As they dug deeper, they uncovered more details about Mariah's life. Friends described her as someone who struggled with feelings of inadequacy. One former coworker revealed that Mariah often compared herself to Kayla, saying things like, "She's the golden twin and I'm just the shadow." It was a sentiment echoed by multiple people who knew the sisters. But the most damning piece of evidence came from a search of Mariah's apartment. Hidden in the back of her bathroom cabinet, detectives found an empty bottle of the same over-the-counter medication used to poison Kayla. It was enough to arrest her, but the case was far from closed. Now they needed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Mariah had both the motive and the means to carry out this carefully planned act. As news of the investigation spread, the community of Maplewood was rocked to its core. People who had known the Johnson twins their whole lives couldn't believe it. How could two sisters, two women who had shared everything from childhood memories to DNA, end up in such a tragic and deadly conflict? It was a question that haunted everyone who knew them. And yet, as the evidence against Mariah mounted, the answer seemed clearer than ever. The rivalry between the sisters had festered for years, and in the end, it had consumed them both. The investigation had already revealed cracks in the seemingly perfect lives of the Johnson sisters. But what came next would shake the case and the community to its core. Investigators, combing through phone records, text messages, and personal accounts, stumbled upon a piece of information that no one was prepared for. It turned out that the man at the center of their rivalry, Derek Thompson, wasn't just dating Kayla. He was also romantically involved with Mariah. Derek had been navigating a web of deception, seeing both sisters simultaneously without either of them knowing. According to text messages recovered from Derek's phone, he had spent months balancing the relationships, meeting Kayla for dinner dates and cozy nights in, while sharing workout sessions and intimate weekends with Mariah. To make matters worse, it became clear that Derek had charmed both women with similar promises of a future together, unknowingly setting the stage for an explosive confrontation. When detectives presented this information to Mariah, her initial reaction was one of shock and denial. She claimed she had no idea Derek was seeing Kayla, but text messages between the sisters painted a different picture. Investigators discovered a heated exchange from just days before Kayla's death, where Mariah accused her sister of betrayal, writing, "How could you do this to me? You've always taken what's mine." The messages were laced with anger and heartbreak, revealing the depth of Mariah's feelings and the intensity of their sibling rivalry. But the most damning piece of evidence came from a forensic analysis of Kayla's apartment. Tucked away in the kitchen, investigators found a shattered wine glass, its jagged edges covered in fingerprints. The prints were later confirmed to belong to Mariah. This discovery, combined with an audio recording left on Kayla's voicemail, painted a vivid picture of what happened that night. The voicemail, a chilling piece of evidence, had been accidentally recorded during the sisters' argument. In the recording, Kayla's voice could be heard trying to diffuse the situation, saying, "Mariah, you need to calm down. This isn't what you think." But Mariah's response was anything but calm. Her voice, trembling with emotion, shouted back, "You've ruined everything! You always ruin everything!" The argument escalated into a loud crash, likely the moment the wine glass shattered, and then silence. The voicemail ended abruptly, leaving investigators to imagine what unfolded in the moments after. When detectives confronted Mariah with this evidence, she broke down during a grueling 6-hour interrogation. At first, she stuck to her story, insisting she had gone to Kayla's apartment that night to talk things through and that the argument had been resolved peacefully. But as the weight of the evidence mounted, her resolve began to crumble. Finally, Mariah confessed. Through tears, she admitted that the argument had turned physical. She claimed she hadn't intended to harm her sister, but that emotions had run high and things had spiraled out of control. According to her account, Kayla had tried to walk away, but Mariah, in a moment of rage, grabbed her arm to stop her. In the struggle that followed, Kayla fell backward, striking her head on the corner of a coffee table. Mariah insisted it was an accident, a tragic result of a heated confrontation. But investigators weren't entirely convinced. The evidence suggested something far more deliberate. The poisoned drink, the calculated timing of Mariah's visit, and the intensity of her prior threats all pointed to premeditation. Mariah's claim that she lost control didn't fully align with the methodical steps she seemed to have taken that night. Adding another layer of complexity to the case was Derek Thompson himself. While he wasn't directly involved in the events of that night, his actions had undoubtedly played a role in the sisters' escalating feud. When questioned by police, Derek appeared genuinely shocked to learn the extent of the rivalry and the tragedy it had caused. He claimed he never meant to hurt either of them and had no idea they were twins until Kayla mentioned it at his birthday party, a revelation that, by then, was too late to undo the damage. The community's reaction to Derek was mixed. Some saw him as an unwitting participant in a tragic story, while others believed his actions' deception, his inability to be honest with either sister, had been the spark that lit the fuse. In interviews, friends of the Johnson family expressed frustration and anger toward Derek, saying he should have known better than to play with the emotions of two women who were already so deeply connected. As the case progressed, these revelations transformed it from a straightforward investigation into a tangled web of emotions, betrayals, and tragic consequences. The trial that followed would force the world to confront the devastating fallout of jealousy, deception, and the toxic combination of love and rivalry. And yet, even as the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together, one question remained. Was Mariah's confession the full truth, or was there more to the story than even she was willing to admit? The answers would come, but they would only deepen the heartbreak. The trial of Mariah Johnson captivated Charlotte and beyond. Cameras rolled as a sobbing Mariah took the stand, recounting the events of that fateful night. She described the argument, her regret, and how she never intended to hurt her sister. Her defense painted her as a woman pushed to her emotional limit, a fragile soul overwhelmed by years of resentment and a betrayal that she claimed shattered her heart. But for the prosecution, her tears weren't enough. Prosecutors argued that Mariah's actions were calculated, pointing to the poisoned drink as evidence of premeditation. They highlighted the series of angry texts sent in the days leading up to Kayla's death and emphasized the voicemail recording that captured her fiery words. Mariah's defense team countered by arguing that the poisoning was a desperate and irrational act, not a plot to kill, but the jury didn't buy it. The evidence was too damning, and the emotional weight of Kayla's untimely death loomed over every moment of the trial. In the end, Mariah Johnson was convicted of second-degree murder. She was sentenced to 25 years in prison, with the judge acknowledging her remorse but underscoring the irreversible damage she had caused. For the Johnson family, it was a bittersweet moment. Justice had been served, but the pain of losing not one but essentially two daughters was a wound that no court ruling could ever heal. Tim Van Dressen told Radio, Mariah, now in her early 30s, began her sentence at the North Carolina Correctional Institution for Women. In a rare interview from prison, she described her anguish over her actions, saying, "I loved my sister. I let my emotions destroy everything. I live with that every day. But for the family she left behind, those words offered little comfort. Kayla was gone forever, and the scars Mariah's actions left on the Johnson household were permanent. The Maplewood community, once close-knit and cheerful, was shaken to its core by the tragedy. Neighbors whispered about how they never saw the rivalry between the twins. Friends of the sisters reflected on the warning signs they may have missed, wondering if their silence allowed things to escalate. Local organizations even began hosting forums on mental health and conflict resolution in hopes of preventing another heartbreak like this one. As for Derek Thompson, the man whose involvement unknowingly became the match to the powder keg, he quietly left Charlotte within weeks of the verdict. He declined to speak publicly about the case, but was said to carry a heavy burden of guilt. Friends described him as a man haunted by the role he played, whether intentional or not, in the unraveling of two lives. His departure from the city left more questions than answers, but perhaps that was the way he wanted it. For the Johnson family, the aftermath of Kayla's death and Mariah's conviction was a time of deep reflection. The tragedy became a harsh lesson on the dangers of harboring resentment and the destructive power of unspoken conflicts. It was a cautionary tale for anyone who thought they truly knew what was happening behind closed doors. The story of Kayla and Mariah Johnson leaves us with more questions than answers. How did the two sisters, who grew up so close, allow jealousy to fester into tragedy? Could this have been avoided, or were the seeds of rivalry planted long before either of them realized? And what responsibility, if any, does Derek Thompson bear for what unfolded? These are questions we may never fully answer, but they remind us of the complexity of human relationships and the fragility of family ties. What are your thoughts on this heartbreaking case? Do you believe Mariah's actions were purely in the heat of the moment, or do you think there was more planning involved? Was Derek truly unaware of the storm he was creating, or could he have stepped in before it was too late? Let us know in the comments. We want to hear your theories. If you found this story compelling, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and turn on the notification bell. We have many more gripping true crime stories on the way, each one as thought-provoking and emotional as this one. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and always remember, sometimes the deepest betrayals come from the people we think we know best.